Hey there, John Hively here. This is going to be episode 5 of the history of the American, that is the United States, oligarchy that now governs both major political parties. And if you don't believe that, if you're a Republican saying, no, the Democrats are an oligarchy, or if you're a Democrat thinking, oh, no, Donald Trump is an oligarch, I got something for you. So let's take a look at a little bit of a news flash right here. This is an example of how oligarchy works and how both major political parties are controlled by the very wealthy via the money they pour into the political markets. And yes, politics is a market. So are the judiciary, the judges. The entire U.S. court system, it seems like. Anyway, here's the example. This is from Fast Company, an independent news organization, on April 11th, 2025. Headlined, Missouri voters backed stronger wage and sick leave laws, and then state Republican legislators repealed them. And then, subheadline, Michigan and Nebraska have seen similar situations play out where state legislators from both parties are rolling back wage policies approved by voters. So voters independently placed on the ballot in those states initiatives for higher minimum wages and paid sick leave, and those initiatives won. And so state legislators, on behalf of their corporate and wealthy billionaire sponsors and friends, bribers, and benefactors, are in the process, have either repealed or in the process of repealing them. And notice too, Nebraska, which Donald Trump took, it's a very conservative state. It doesn't matter that the Republicans in the state legislature, to them, that the voters wanted the higher minimum wages. It only mattered to them what their big billionaire donors wanted. Anyway, so that's something to be said. Now, the second thing we're going to get to, which is the rise of the oligarchy. First of all, you recall that in previous episodes that FDR and the Great Depression put an end to the first oligarchy. But then those folks always remained rich, but less powerful politically, financially. So they were always lurking in the shadows, and in an effort to rise up and destroy democracy and reestablish the oligarchy. And so their chance came with President Richard Nixon in 1968, and Nixon nominated to the court Lewis Powell. Who was Lewis Powell? That's the important thing, because he wrote something called the Lewis Powell Memo. 2 months before Richard Nixon nominated him to the court, Powell had handed in to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce higher-ups, which he'd been commissioned by, to write a 6,000-plus word manifesto that serves as the blueprint of the corporate oligarchy that we have today, the dystopia that we have today, in which the rich are getting richer and everyone else is getting more poor, working more and earning less. Anyway, so we're going to look at who was Lewis Powell, and we're going to use the Lever News, some of the things that, and I recommend the Lever News as a investigative online subscription journal. They've got a paper, they've got a series of this is not a paid advertisement, this is just a recommendation. They've got some really good stuff, investigative journalism going on over there. Kind of reminds me a lot of ProPublica. Anyway, so who was Lewis Powell? And the first thing to understand is the news media painted him like this when he was nominated to the court, and after he died, after he left the court, and then after he died. They made him look like this guy.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine?
So that's Mr. Rogers. And by the way, in case you're wondering, this is Lewis Powell, and he looks a lot like Mr. Rogers, except he's got a prunier face and he's got glasses. Anyway, so what was Lewis Powell really like? This is what Lewis Powell really was like.
Now, young Skywalker, you will die.
So, for Lewis Powell, it wasn't a case of saying, "Oh, young Skywalker, you will die." It was more of a case of, "Oh, young democracy, now you will die." Because that's what his manifesto was all about. And the higher-ups in the Chamber of Commerce went about using it. So who was Lewis Powell? And we're going to use some things from Lever News. So, Lever News calls it the master plan, the reestablishment of the oligarchy. That's what I call it, and I think that's what it is. And you've got to understand some of the more important things that maybe Lever News doesn't understand and others don't understand, is that 69 to 100% of the total income and wealth of the 1%, the top, basically the top 1/2 of 1%, that it's all based on the financial markets, the stock markets. So the key thing is to keep the stock market values, the value of stocks rolling up. Because if they're rolling down, you're decreasing their power, their wealth, all their income and wealth. 69 to 100% of it is determined by the stock market. So let's think about Lewis Powell. For one thing, when he was on the court, I think it was in 1984, so he was nominated in 71, and he was sworn in January 1972. And Lewis Powell was the wealthiest man on the court. He was a millionaire. I think he was the only millionaire in 1984. And he derived much of his income from stocks. He was a big-time investor in stocks. So according to his Washington Post obituary. So, but let's get into Lewis Powell and what the Lever had to say about him. So how did this Southern gentleman, who came off like Mr. Rogers and was presented as a Mr. Rogers type, the friendliest guy in town, this genteel corporate lawyer whose core virtues were supposedly his pragmatism and moderation, how did this guy become the author of a stridently ideological manifesto and an early architect of the dystopia that we live in today? Well, he was a graduate of Lewis and Washington and Lee University. He got his master's degree in law. He went to Harvard University, where he obtained his law degree. Then he came back in the 1930s and got a degree with a prestigious law firm in Richmond, Virginia, where he was from. And his daddy was wealthy enough to send him to private schools his whole life. So he didn't even know what a public school was like, at least not going to one. So in World War II, Powell went into the military, served in the intelligence agencies, and then after the war he went back to his old firm, which dealt with tobacco cases and other things, and he was in charge of policies such as deregulating finance and ensuring the tobacco companies were profitable from a legal perspective. He became a member of the Richmond School Board, and he became chairman of that board. And in the 1960s, he disagreed with the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, when the Supreme Court decided segregation was not legal. In other words, he believed Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, that Supreme Court decision, was the right decision made. He believed in segregation. So he was 64 years old when he got the call from the Richard Nixon to be the Supreme Court nominee. One thing that's vitally important to understand is the Powell Memo was written and handed into the U.S. Chamber of Commerce only 2 months earlier than his nomination. So Nixon might very well have been aware of what he had written in his manifesto, in Powell's manifesto. It's the tobacco stuff that's very interesting. So he was on the board of directors of several major corporations, including Philip Morris. So he was also an architect of some of their attacks against the science linking tobacco with cancer and other ailments. So I'm going to read here from Lever News. In the mid-1960s, Powell was one of the big defenders of Marlboro Country, i.e. Philip Morris. When the Surgeon General began issuing reports that linked smoking to cancer and other health problems, Philip Morris saw itself under attack. They considered themselves the victims. But Philip Morris and the tobacco industry didn't just sit back and accept regulations. They went on the offensive, creating alternative organizations and pushing their own scientific reports to support their arguments to the media and the courts. Its CEO, Joseph Coleman, was actively defending their product on television programs like Face the Nation. Coleman once said on Face the Nation, and I quote, "And I concluded from that report that it's true that babies born from women who smoke are smaller. Yes, sir, they're smaller, but they are just as healthy, we believe, as babies born to women who do not smoke. Some women would prefer having smaller babies." Unquote. And that wasn't an exact quote, but pretty damn close. Anyway, in March, I embellished it just a little bit. Anyway, in March 1970, Coleman and Philip Morris started using front groups to attack the American Cancer Society, which was spotlighting the link between tobacco and cancer. Powell was the legal counsel who helped craft these programs, guiding specific lobbying efforts, communication strategies, and legal frameworks, all in an effort to protect profits and sow doubts about any adverse health claims. So he wrote a letter to Joseph Coleman in May 1970. Powell wrote this letter, and he wrote to Coleman, "As you know," and I quote, and this will be a definite, a 100% quote, "As you know, I have long thought that the tobacco industry could not continue indefinitely to ignore the extremism and lack of regard for the truth manifested by the American Cancer Society and others. I believe your recent moves have been justified and constructive. At the very least, the American Cancer Society is likely to be more restrained in the future. And to be clear," this is Lever News, "Powell is writing this to Philip Morris CEO, even though he and the tobacco industry knew, based on their own studies, that cigarettes were killing people." So there you go. The architect of the destruction of democracy, the guy who wrote the blueprint for it, was on the Supreme Court in January 1972. And he was the Shave Palpatine, the guy who was going to destroy the elected representative in the Star Wars Galactic Republic, who went about his way undermining the Galactic Republic and turning it into an empire with him at the head. For Associate Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell was the same guy. Exact same guy. He was the guy who supported genocide for profit, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans per year with tobacco profits. Anyway, we're going to get on to episode 6, hopefully in the next 2 days. If you guys like this show, please subscribe, like, and share. You have a good one. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.